We've been starting a new series called The Mission. The first week we looked at Gripped by God, and 2 weeks ago, and this week we're looking at the good hand of God. It's a story of Nehemiah. We're in chapter 2 this week. We started in chapter 1. Now, I had different ideas about what to call this series. I was going to call it Building Back Better, but I thought that was a bad idea. I thought maybe not. We won't go there. Some of you don't even get that joke. I'm sorry, but I felt like the mission was the right way to address this book. Now, because it is a historical book and there's a lot of figures in here, we've had to look at history, and I want to bring you up to date by doing that again. This takes place in the Persian Empire, and in the Persian Empire, let's see if I can, what's happening is in the city of Susa is where Nehemiah is at this time, and then he'll be going to Jerusalem, and the concerns are for Jerusalem. That's actually over a 900-mile journey, so you can see how huge that pink area the Persian Empire is that Artaxerxes has responsibility over. It's massive. And this is where this is taking place. And when this is taking place is important as well. I'm repeating some of the things we looked at before because we have to be reminded. The people of Israel were established in the land, and they had been warned by the prophets that God would remove them from their place. And in 587 BC, 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and so was the temple. The book of Jeremiah especially, and book of Ezekiel is written during this period of time, and the minor prophets, some of the minor prophets as well. And then you have them exiled to Babylon. Many of the people are carried away, and then in 536, actually, a man named Cyrus comes to power. In 539, 538 through 536, there are many changes in the policies, and a man named Cyrus issues a decree to return the people to Jerusalem. This decree is recorded in several places in the Bible, including the book of Ezra, which is coupled up with the book of Nehemiah. And here's what Cyrus says in the decree in the book of Ezra. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He's given him this big empire. And he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. In other words, Cyrus sends the people, a remnant of the people, not all of them, a remnant of the people back to Jerusalem for the purpose of building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. So we see this biblical text where this man named Cyrus, who's come into power over this huge empire, is sending a remnant of the Jews who'd been carried away back to Jerusalem for the purpose of rebuilding the temple. It took them longer than they expected, 21 years. And they completed that second temple, which was really not as magnificent, as glorious as Solomon's temple, but it was a temple that later Herod built on, became a magnificent center of worship in Jerusalem. And then we have the reign of Xerxes in 486. That is when the book of Esther is written, and the events in the book of Esther take place. And then we have his son, Artaxerxes, 465. And this is the reign where the book of Ezra and Nehemiah take place. So as we enter the book, we're looking at all of this history. These remnant of people have gone back to Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the temple. But something's happened in Jerusalem. They've not rebuilt the city. They're actually in poverty. They're struggling. There's difficulty. Over 50 years later, they are struggling. They're impoverished. They're actually oppressed by their neighbors. They don't have political freedom. Their city is in shambles. The temple is there, and temple worship is followed somewhat, but as a people, they're in distress. Now, I want to show you something here Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra, the dates are disputed to some extent, but 458 is Ezra's appearance, and 445 now is when we find Nehemiah, 20 years into the reign of Artaxerxes. I want to show you something. Anybody know what that is? It's not a loaf of bread, a stale bread or anything. That is called the cylinder of Cyrus. That is something I took a picture of when my wife and I were visiting in Southern California, visiting our son out there at the Getty Museum. That is actually a clay cuneiform cylinder, and all of that writing on there is actually cuneiform writing. There's actually a message in there. And I want to read to you a little bit of what this is an archaeological artifact. I want to read to you a little bit of what that cuneiform says. This says, it's called the Cylinder of Cyrus, written by Cyrus. I returned to these sacred cities, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all the former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. In other words, this historical artifact confirms what is in the Bible, that it was a policy of Cyrus, not necessarily as an enlightened worshiper of Yahweh, but it was a policy of Cyrus to take all of the people Nebuchadnezzar had led into exile and to send them back to where they came from. So this is a direct confirmation that what the Bible says Cyrus did, archaeological evidence confirms that this was his policy. So his policy was to repatriate the people back where they came from and ask them to rebuild their temples. And he was not a worshiper of Yahweh, but he believed all of these temples being restored and worshiping would do him some good. He was a bit of a polytheist. So we have Cyrus's cylinder there. What we're going to discover in our examination of Scripture today is a very simple but crucial truth for each one of us. True ministry, true mission is a work of grace. It's not a work of talent. Talent is useful, helpful, and we all need it and want more of it. It is not a work of grit, simply gritting your teeth and deciding you're going to get this done. We all need grit. We better have grit if we're going to get anything done, but that's not what accomplishes the will and the purpose of God. It's not even a work of human will. We can will and desire to do all the things in the world that we want to do, but the work of God is accomplished by the grace of God, by the hand of God upon Nehemiah. That is how God accomplishes his purpose. And Nehemiah understands this and repeats this 3 times in the passages we will look at this week and next week. By the good hand of my God upon me. It is not because I had this position as the king's cupbearer and was very close to him. And evidence historically tells us cupbearers are often not only the most trusted people in the palace, but actually become the king's favorite in many cases. It is not because of who I am, it's because of the good hand of my God upon me. It's not because of my organizational skill. Many people look at Nehemiah and say, well, this is a book about organizational skill. No, this is a book about the good hand of my God upon me. That's what it's about. Thank God for the talent. Thank God for the grit. Thank God for the will. Thank God for the skill. Without the good hand of God, none of this is possible. None of it is possible. And Nehemiah understands that. And the skills that he has, the position that he has, the advantage that he has, all are used by God to accomplish his purpose. Jesus put it this way: without me, you can do you know how much? Nothing. Without me, you can do nothing. That is how dependent we are on the grace of God. I like the way the hymn puts it. As related to salvation. And I believe it relates to mission and effective ministry. Rock of ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy wounded side which flowed be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. Not the labor of my hands can fulfill thy law's demands. Could my zeal no respite know? Could my tears forever flow? All for sin could not atone. Thou must save, and thou alone. You see, it appears to me that Nehemiah, as I've read this passage, understands everything he has, everything he does, all of his skills, all of his wonderful traits, everything that he's learned in the king's palace, which is probably immense as a cupbearer. As I said 2 weeks ago, he saw how the sausage was made. He witnessed negotiations. He witnessed the king receiving his counselors, receiving ambassadors. He saw how empire business was done. He understood it as well as anybody because he was simply a witness to it. All that he had was nothing without the good hand of his God upon him. It was the grace of God that empowered him to do what he did, which was quite remarkable. Now, let's look at the passage, and I just want to make a few points. This is a decree that Artaxerxes made about Jerusalem before we get to chapter 2 in Nehemiah. And it tells you a lot about the undercurrent of what is happening in this book. Artaxerxes has written a letter to the people in Jerusalem because the people in Jerusalem are concerned that some of the Jews want to rebuild the city. They want to build it back up. And they've written to Artaxerxes saying, hey, the Jews here are rebuilding Jerusalem. It's going to be a big problem to you if they do that. And the king, Artaxerxes, who Nehemiah is the cupbearer, gets this letter. He writes him back a letter. And this is what it says. He says, make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that this city not be rebuilt until a decree is made by me. In other words, Artaxerxes telling the governor, don't let them go forward with the project of rebuilding the walls or rebuilding the city. And take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? He's convinced if they rebuild the city, he's going to have problems. And further, he says, when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai, the scribe, and their associates, they went in haste to the Jews at Jerusalem, and by force and power they made them cease. They stopped building the city. The temple had been completed, but the walls of the city lay in ruin. The city lay in ruin, and the people were in distress. This is the actual political situation that Nehemiah walks into. As you heard 2 weeks ago, he got a report that this is the situation in Jerusalem. And he began praying and he began seeking the Lord. He said, Lord, have mercy upon the city. And he didn't see the big picture that Jerusalem was going to be the place where the Messiah was to come. But he knew this was important for the purposes of God. He said, Lord, restore the city. And then he determined to go into the king and to ask permission to do what the king had already said shouldn't be done. Do you know what that means in an Eastern government under a despot and an emperor? It means you are putting your head on the line. That's what it means. Any of you ever jump out of an airplane? I see one hand. I see that hand. I can't figure out why anybody would want to jump out of a perfectly good airplane? I have friends that have done it. Jim McIntosh, my friend, I think he learned in the Army. He likes to, I don't know if he still does, but did like to go skydiving. Our own Leonard Robinette jumped out of an airplane, I think when he was 70. My brothers jumped out of airplanes. I will never, ever, ever jump out of an airplane. Now, it is possible, and you can do it, and you can survive, but you'll never get me to do it. You'll never get me to do it. Well, I look at the challenge before Nehemiah as similar to jumping out of an airplane for someone who really has a fear of heights. He knows he needs to do it. He knows things could go terribly wrong, but he also knows he could land on his feet. And by faith, he decides to take the step. So here it is. Nehemiah is praying to the Lord, give success to your servant today, and grant him success in the sight of this man. This man is the king. In the month of Nisan, this is after 4 months of praying, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. I think not just because the king had sussed him out, because now he knew he had to take the step to explain to the king what he had been praying about and what he had determined to do and what God had put onto his heart. I said to the king, let the king live forever. King, I'm on your side. What I'm going to tell you is going to insult you. It might upset you. It might cause you to punish me, but I want you to know I want you to live forever. I really do. And then he says, why should not my face be sad when you have this crummy policy for the city of my people? He didn't put it that way. But it's implied, it's the undercurrent when the city, place of my father's graves, the one that you wrote to those people about, not to allow it to be rebuilt, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. And all of a sudden the king is having a change of heart. And I don't know if you noticed in the letter he wrote, he said, until a further decree is made by me. And now he's getting information that makes him think maybe we should change the policy. But Nehemiah didn't know he was open to that. But only by praying and interceding was the Lord working on the heart of the ruler and turning it like rivers wherever he will. And the king said to me, what are you getting at here? He must have known Nehemiah quite well. He must have understood his temperament and his communication. He said, Nehemiah, what are you getting at? What are you requesting? And I prayed to the God of heaven. And a lot of people say, well, that's all the prayer you have to do. You just kind of pray at the last minute like you do on your exams. Just going to pray at the last minute. No. He's refortifying 4 months of prayer. He said, okay, God, this is it. I am jumping out of the airplane. That's what he's doing. He is jumping. And so here's what happens. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that's an important preamble. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to Judah, that place where all the political controversy has been recently. Send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. This is a huge request. It's massive, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting behind him, so this is some kind of social occasion, how long will you be gone? Boy, that was quick. That was quick. Nehemiah's flight through the air wasn't even that long. And he's on his feet on the ground. How long will you be gone? When will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, by the way, I'm going to need some other help. If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. That's called a transit visa. Some of you remember the Iron Curtain. You know, when you wanted to go Berlin from Western Europe, you had to pass through Eastern Europe if you went by car. And when you came to the border, you had to have a transit visa to allow you to pass through East Germany to get to Berlin. That's what Nehemiah is asking for. He's asking for a transit visa, a letter from the king that says, let these folks go through by my order. And he said, also, I'd like a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, for the wall of the city and the house that I should build. I would like about $2 or $3 million worth of materials, Artaxerxes, please. I mean, maybe more than that. Who knows in today's money? That's what he's asking for. Maybe 5, maybe 10. I have no idea. What would it cost to repair the walls? I have no idea. What kind of timber are we talking about? Man, he is just flying through the air. And that parachute is open. And he's asking, am I going to land on my feet? And the king granted me what I had asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. It's not because I was persuasive and charming, not because I had a relationship with the king, not because I knew exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to get done, but because God gave me favor with the most powerful person on the face of the earth. That's what happened. That's what's going on here. This is a big deal for Nehemiah and Artaxerxes, and he quickly moves, the narrative quickly moves to the journey. He says, I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. And now the king had sent me with officers of the army and horsemen. He had lots of clout here. Not only the king's letters, but representatives of the king's army were with him. King's officials. This was official business. You know why it was so important that he have all of this in a row? Because the king had already written, said, don't let this happen until a further decree comes from me. Now this is the further decree, and Nehemiah is both the catalyst and the embodiment of that further decree. I've changed my mind. We're going to rebuild Jerusalem. We're going to rebuild the city, and you guys who wrote to me to stop it are going to pay for it. You're going to do the labor that creates all of the timber, and all of the materials are going to go to Jerusalem, and you're going to set it up. And you know what? They did not like it one bit. They certainly didn't. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. Now this is going to be a big part of this series, is the conflict that takes place between Sanballat, Tobiah, and another man named Geshem, with Nehemiah and those who were working with him. It's going to be a big part of this study that we do, this series of messages. Who are these people? Sanballat and Tobiah, and a man that will later be mentioned in this chapter named Geshem, we all have archaeological evidence on. We all have historical records on outside the Bible. They're very powerful and significant people. Sanballat was the governor of Samaria, which was the region that had been repopulated by an Assyrian king. And they had a very mixed religious system that recognized Yahweh as creator, but also worshiped other gods. And they, in fact, had a temple there that was built right around this time, the Society for Biblical Archaeology tells us. And so what they're doing in Jerusalem is in direct competition with what's happening in Samaria, and Samaria doesn't like it. Tobiah, the Ammonite, we know, also from archaeological evidence, was part of a very well-known ruling family in Ammon for generations. This is the early stages of their Ammonite dynasty. There's another man named Geshem, whose family we know from archaeological evidence and archaeological digs and written materials was the head of an Arab league of sorts. And so Jerusalem was surrounded by those who did not want them to succeed in this mission of rebuilding the temple, but rebuilding the city, so that one day, generations from now, from this time, the Messiah of Israel could come in fulfillment of prophecy, riding on a donkey, which we celebrated some weeks ago, being hailed as the King of the Jews, and to be crucified, and to die, to be buried, and to be raised from the dead. That city had to exist in order for that to happen. This thing had to be rebuilt in order for God's purposes and prophecies to be fulfilled. Nehemiah doesn't even know how deeply involved he is in, here it comes, eschatology. Nehemiah got up when he talked, he said, as king, I just feel like I'm engaging in some eschatology right now. Setting things up for the future of God's big purposes. No. God's setting you up. God's using you. No, God's not setting up. That sounds a little sinister, doesn't it? He's not setting you up. He is establishing you. He's using you. He's working through you to accomplish purposes you don't know. And we rebel against them. We chafe at them. We're troubled by them. We're disturbed by them because they're agitating and difficult. We're going to see how much agitation and difficulty Nehemiah is going to go through here. Well, see just a few things that we've read. True mission, as we said, is birthed in a season of extended prayer. Nehemiah has been praying and seeking the Lord. This is the power behind what he's doing, praying and fasting for months at a time. It's said of C.H. Spurgeon, the Baptist preacher from England in the 19th century, that when visitors would come to Spurgeon's church, he would take them to the basement prayer room where people were always on their knees interceding. And then Spurgeon would declare, here is the powerhouse of this church. He also said, if God be near a church, it must pray. One of the first tokens of his absence will be slothfulness in prayer. True mission is birthed an extended season of prayer, and it is dependent upon God's favor, as Nehemiah has said over and over again, according to the good hand of my God upon me. And he will repeat this saying, it is by God's providence he is the cupbearer. It is by God's providence that he has this place and this role. But it is by God's grace that he succeeds. And he will face great obstacles, the first of which, getting up the courage to ask Artaxerxes to change his policy and to send him to rebuild the city. The successful mission often requires human endorsement. You know what? This is an important point. None of this is happening, brothers and sisters. None of it is happening unless Artaxerxes, a human king who probably did not worship Yahweh at all, had to say, I'm backing you. I'm behind you. I'm going to support your doing this. You know what? This is a big thing about ministry. I want you to understand. This is a big point in the book I wrote about getting ordination right. Many of us feel called or feel a sense to do things for God. But the church has, throughout its history, recognized two things. It has recognized that internal sense of calling, and it's also recognized for that internal sense of calling to be valid, it must be or should be, under normal circumstances, confirmed by the body that this is what should be done. When Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch and praying and fasting, it was the body of Christ that said, "Set apart for me, Paul and Barnabas, for the work to which I have called them." In other words, there was this internal preparation in their hearts, but the prophecy came through the people of God and said, "Go." These two things have to play together. We're part of a body. We're part of a people who work and cooperate together. That's how it works. And in Nehemiah's case, he had to have approval not of a member of his synagogue, but of the most powerful person in the world. It's interesting. There's a story about Harry Truman when Israel was being established as a nation. One of his advisors, Clark Clifford, wrote this. This was in 1948. This was a huge controversy in the United States State Department and executive branch. It was a huge controversy. George C. Marshall, the Marshall Plan, he was adamantly opposed to that recognition. There's this, Clifford documents it. But he gives several reasons, and this isn't the only one, but it's one of them. He says, Truman was a student and believer in the Bible from his youth. And from his reading of the Old Testament, he believed the Jews derived a legitimate historical right to Palestine. And he sometimes cited biblical lines such as Deuteronomy 1:8, "Behold, I've given up the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land, which the Lord has sworn unto your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob." I only quote this for this reason. Here is what at that time was the most powerful man in the world, being sensitive to the teaching of Scripture, the instruction that he believed came to him from the Spirit of God. So it was with Artaxerxes. God works through powerful people, whether they know it or not. It's an amazing thing. That gives me hope to pray for people in authority. That God would move hearts, change policies, work in people's lives. Finally, successful mission will meet opposition. Here's a conflict. By the way, those are the steps of the temple that they believe was built at this time or shortly after. In Samaria, the Samaritan temple, it was destroyed years later. But they were building their own system, and they were opposing the system that was being built in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was facing a big struggle, and we'll talk about that later. Lots of opposition. These people are powerful, and they are not sympathetic to Nehemiah's mission, and they have a completely different agenda. There is conflict. Speed Lee's writes about issues, church issues, and others. Says conflict happens when two individuals or two groups try to occupy the same space at the same time. The Judeans have come to occupy the space that the Samaritans believes belongs to them, and there is unending conflict. You know what? There's conflict right down to today. So Nehemiah's mission has only begun. He faces many dangers, toils, and snares. It is grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Now, the greatest conflict is this. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. You know why we, in following Christ, whoever you are, if you're following Christ, you're going to face conflict. You're going to face differences. And hopefully it's coming from without. Because you have been translated into a different kingdom, and that kingdom of darkness is fighting you every step of the way. You see this in your jobs, in your businesses, in your classrooms. Christ is the example of faithfulness in spite of every obstacle. So let's keep Nehemiah's experience of the hand of God in mind. Know that without him you can do nothing. I encourage you to cultivate a prayer life based on God's promises. Be prepared for many dangers, toils, and snares. Jesus prepared his people. If they hate me, they will hate you. There will be many dangers, toils, and snares. But also, be confident of victory. God has for you, I mean you. Yes, I mean you. Raise your hands. I encourage you, just raise your hands for you to receive victory in the midst of your struggles. Why? Because of the good hand of your God upon you. He is with you. He is not against you. He will help you see your way through to where you need to be. Trust in him, and he will do it.